Thanks everyone for coming. It's good to have you here. I would like to begin by thanking all the people who have made this possible. First of all, I would like to thank the Office of the Provost for supporting this and making this possible. It's very important that the university supports this kind of activities that come from the humanities and social sciences, and I hope this can happen more often. I would also like to thank Katie Vernon, the chair of the Hispanic Languages Department, for supporting this, and actually all my colleagues from the Hispanic Languages Department. I would like to thank also Paul Firbus, the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the chair of the History Department, Gary Marker, who's here with us as well, and Paul Gutenberg, professor of the History Department, who has been very enthusiastic as well, supporting this. And also Sean Chandra, the chair of the Sociology Department, and especially Tiffany Joseph, who's also here and has been very enthusiastic about organizing this and supporting this. And I would like also to thank Jody Broderick, the administrative person in the Hispanic Languages Department. She has been very, very helpful in organizing everything, this talk. And especially I would like to thank Lilia Schwarcz, who's here with us today. She's a full professor of anthropology in Brazil's one of Brazil's top universities, the São Paulo University of São Paulo, and she does a really interdisciplinary work. Although she is an anthropologist, she works. She has a very strong dialogue with colleagues in history. She's also a historian. She has published very important history books. Her main interests are the history of slaves, racial theories, as many of you have been able to read her text, history of the Brazilian court, history of 19th century Brazil, academic art, and history of anthropology in Brazil. She has published several books. I'm not gonna name them all, but I'm gonna name the two books that have been published so far, translated into English. They are The Spectacle of the Races, Scientists, Institutions, and Racial Theories in Brazil at the End of the 19th Century. And the other book is The Emperor's Beard, Dom Pedro II, A Tropical King. Professor Schwarcz won on 3 occasions, actually, the Djibouti Prize, which is Brazil's most important literary prize. She has also curated many different exhibitions. She's currently developing an exhibition on Brazilian history through the present. And she has been a visiting professor at Oxford University in the UK and at Leiden University, also at Columbia University, and since 2011, she is a global professor at Princeton University. So please welcome Lilia Schwarcz here with us today. Just a brief comment, a more practical comment now. Of course, Professor Schwarcz, after her talk, will be open to questions from the audience, so you're very welcome to go ahead and ask her anything that you would like to know more about her talk. This is for my HOS student, the class. Remember that I'm going to be tomorrow. I will have office hours tomorrow from 2:30 to 4. You're very welcome to come. I cannot answer questions about the midterm now, but you're very welcome to write to me as well. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, I cannot ask questions about the midterm, but I'll do my best here. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here at Stony Brook University. I want to thank the Hispanic department and the literature department. It's the same. I want to thank Javier Huarte for this invitation. That's very good to be here. I lost the first page, so I need the first. I also want to explain that I decided to select one particular case, the case of the black writer Lima Barreto. I'm going to use his example, the example of Lima Barreto, as a way to show how in Brazil, in the beginning of the Republican regime, there was a very perverse situation that put together social markers of difference like gender, class, region, and mainly race. Immediately before the end of slavery in Brazil, racial theories became very fashionable, proving that citizenship was not for all. In a country where, at that time, and made in Rio de Janeiro, the former capital of Brazil, 75% of the population were black, Lima Barreto was one of the few intellectuals or even politicians to declare himself as a black writer. On the top of it, he used it to say that his literature was a black one and created autobiographical characters that always tried to show and to prove how racist the country was. That is why I call this lecture Race and Citizenship in the Turn of the Century. After the equality of the law, after Republican law, scientific racial theories were going to create a second and an inferior citizenship. So let me start. During the time of the Brazilian Empire, a black elite very much connected with the crown enjoyed a relative preeminence. They were freedmen, liberal workers that, with the beginning of the 20th century, during the Republican regime, suffered various kinds of social exclusion, together with a new birth of a concept, the concept of race. Several examples, others, Brazilian intellectuals, in considering the limitations and specificities of modernity in Brazil. But the social experience of this group helps a lot to understand the limits of modernity and to conceptualize freedom and equality in the nation. My interest shall, let me put here, my interest shall be less in detail revisiting of Lima Barreto's biography than to focus in a special moment, Barreto's admission in the psychiatric hospital in 1914 and 1918. This case is particularly interesting, in my opinion, considering that Lima Barreto, far from being a victim of his time, was, especially in the early moments of the Republic and of his career also, a major protagonist of the Republic. He effectively spoke out regarding various events that marked that period. I'm talking about the vaccine revolt in 1904, in addition to claiming his place as a literary figure against the conservative Brazilian Academy of Letters. He led his own newspaper, the Florial, and also a bohemian group, while publishing articles, chronicas, pamphlets, and short stories in the major newspapers in Rio de Janeiro as Malho, as you can see here. Nonetheless, my main goal shall not laud his social protagonism as isolated from the constrictions of his time, nor put aside the suffering that marked his final years. Furthermore, as Max Weber used to mention, the individual is entangled in the web he helped to weave. Further, in this vein, Lima Barreto was truly a character of his time. A time with various forms of controversy, ambiguities, and polemics. So let me talk about ambiguities. First, it's possible to state that abolition of the slavery in Brazil abolished more than slavery. Abolition was responsible for collapsing a complex system of social mechanisms of difference. Second, critically inquiring about race relations in the context of the First Republic means to understand also the new barriers to mobility due to new scientific discourses of race. That was the moment where phrenology, determinist theories, and racial models became very strong in the country. Those models created racial inequalities and condemned miscegenation, madness, but also tuberculosis, epilepsy, and were signs of or even stigmas of physical and mental degeneration. And there was no future to a country like Brazil, a country that was really miscegenated. Equality and freedom during this period are to be understood in different perspectives. As sociologist Antônio Sérgio Guimarães noted, if freedom was black, equality was white. In other words, if abolition considered freedom, equality among humanity was to be reevaluated in that context. Racial criterion would powerfully reemerge at the end of the 19th century and create new forms of social hierarchy and stratifications. Following an era of liberation, the end of the 19th century brought about what became known as the embarrassment of exclusion. That's an expression of Leo Spitzer. And the return in a reformulated biological basis of models of othering. Hannah Arendt referred to liberalism as the theory of the individual. For her, racial theories were a group model. But even so, if I would take the anthropologist Luigi Mon's opinion, what he demonstrates is that racism does not represent the opposite side of liberalism. To tell you the truth, is like a kind of continuation of this model. Third argument, one cannot forget the widespread fear regarding new forms of slavery and the return of the old ones. There were neither guarantees nor certainties in this environment of ambiguity. This is why the particular social context demanded reaction, protagonism, and agency. Some black intellectuals prefer to be described as whites. Others, like Lima Barreto, found agency through color, albeit in a very ambivalent fashion. On the one hand, Lima Barreto highlighted his Afro-Brazilian and slave heritage whenever he had the opportunity. He referred to his house as Quilombo Village, and often said he was writing a black germinal, germinal negro. As a writer, he explored the color of his characters or demonstrated that racism of his society, as in Clara dos Anjos, in which book a young black female protagonist morally loses her life and her destiny, or in Recordações do escrivão Isaías Caminha, whose protagonist, Isaías Caminha, realized he was black on his way to the city. On the other hand, however, whenever he could, Barreto displayed his difference when compared to other black residents of the city, mainly in the outskirts, os subúrbios, as we call it. Clara dos Anjos, a kind of alter ego of Lima Barreto, used to say, those strange people of the suburbs. At the same time that Barreto defended the rise of a literature more culturally aligned with everyday life and language, at the same time, he used it to correct the incorrect speech of the people. And he used it to say, contaminate by the terms of the past of slavery. Difference and sameness are part of the same mimetic game. He used it to write against soccer, against candomblé, and against capoeira. And at the same time, he used it to denounce the mania of importation. As I think you read in the short story, the man who knew how to speak Javanese. I think you read it, no? He failed to enter 3 times in the Academy of Letters, Brazilian Academy of Letters. And he loved to talk against the same institution. But there were no other time in which the state of ambiguity that I'm trying to describe was really, really strong than during his admission in the National Psychiatric Hospital. This is Clara dos Anjos. This is the hospital. The hospital functions as a group of metaphor, as well as the most difficult reality for the writer who cathartically confessed in his diary that his body betrayed him. Although a strong critic of the scientific theories of race, Lima Barreto feared that those determinist stigmas then he contested were writing themselves into his personal history. The fear of madness was the central theme in a series of short stories and novels by Barreto, as the very well-known Triste Fim de Policarpo Quaresma. In the other books, he always showed an engaged literature, as Barreto himself used it to define his work. He sought to transform all the time the social others in a kind of national us. Nevertheless, in his chronicles, diaries, and an incomplete novel called Cemetery of the Living, written during his stay at the Hospital Nacional, the mirroring process was very clear. He says, the destiny leveled me. I forgot my education. I did not complain. I do not complain. I will not complain. Lima Barreto entered in this hospital in a moment where the hospital was becoming to be a very important institution. The asylum quickly became the greatest laboratory for such theories. He used it to divide men and women, adults and children, and also divided social origins. Patients were divided by behavior: passive, agitated, unclean, and those affected for other illness. Lima Barreto entered in the institution in 1914. Already a writer of some fame, he seemed to be in those circumstances like an afflicted patient, subject to the delirium of the alcohol. His personal history seemed to repeat racial theories of the time and the more negative prognosis. He used it to say in his diary that one cannot escape one's race and its stigmas. At that time, Henrique Roxo was a physician and a director of the hospital, and he, in a disposition in the Second Latin American Medical Congress in 1904, asserted that mulattoes should be considered uninvolved types. According to him, if everyone carried some sort of hereditary defects, it weighed a lot heavier in the case of mixed racial groups. Roxo also included social history arguments in his disposition, blaming that sudden abolition had a great propension to disorganize the country. I think you know that Brazil was the last country in the Occident to abolish slavery, and just in 1888. So it's very difficult to understand why Roxo is talking about a sudden abolition. Lima Barreto, this is one image of the children's in the hospice. This is a quotation from Lima Barreto in the hospice. I just can't see black. And this is the father. Lima Barreto knew madness through his own family. João Henrique that was the first unemployed monarchical servant, a former typographist, was sent to work in the colonies of the alienated in Ilha do Governador, Governor Island. In 1902, Lima Barreto's father, João Henrique, became mad. And that was the moment when Lima Barreto had to give up with his education, his formation, and then went to work as a public employee. It was at that moment, exactly at that moment, that he started drinking. As we saw, Barreto was first admitted in 1914. That same year, in the same book of registration, one can find other patients, each having to bear their personal dramas described in brief reports that mentions altercations, religious and political manias, aggressiveness, criminality, religious fanatics, alcoholism, jealousy, and other various experiences. That's the umbrella, the big umbrella of madness. The file brings forth a recurring universe. The vast majority of the internees are Brazilians. Their complexion, physical threats, and hair reveals that overwhelming portions of cases of madness were found among dark and poor people. From the observation files emerged the difficult and certainly hierarchized dialogue between patient and medical professional. Although the diagnosis tended to be varied: alcoholism, epilepsy, psychosis, episodic delirium, senile dementia, the treatment tended to repeat itself between purgatives, opium, and tranquilizing tonics. Lima Barreto wished to be classified as a writer, but instead, or at least, was listed as a public employee. It was a profession that he so often mocked and considered much less relevant than his commitment to literature. Barreto, this is the anamnesis, as we call it. Barreto, always mirroring himself with his favorite writer, Fyodor Dostoevsky, notes in his diaries the humiliation he felt in losing his identity and seeing himself transformed into a mulatto, into one of those that so often manifested the weakness of mestizo madness. In his diary, he wrote, and I quote, "The mental capacity of blacks is always discussed a priori. That of the white is a posteriori. Science is a Greek prejudice." Time to enter in this dialogical dialogue, and I'm using Bakhtin with this idea of having a dialogical dialogue. This entry in August 18, 1914, certainly stand out for the amalgam of the unknown and forgotten names. The writer, Afonso Henrique de Lima Barreto. Sporting the typical jumpsuit with a stamped pandemonium, I don't know if you can read, it's that pandemonium. He really, the young man focused on the camera. Pandemonium is the translation of the English pandemonium, the etymology of which stems from the Greek radical pan, meaning all, attached to the Greek translation of demon, diamond. The neologism was created by Milton. in his masterpiece, Paradise Lost, in order to designate the Satan's palace. It also designates the Inferno's imaginary capital. What matters here, though, is that the image of pandemonium is central to Lima Barreto's experience, especially in the case of his novel, The Cemetery of the Living, in which Barreto had drawn a similar portrait of the hospital, either an inferno or a cemetery. In his records, aside from his profession and physical appearance, what is most strange is his racial categorization. Contrary to the picture and his personal history, Lima Barreto is listed, as you can see, as white. It's complicated to discern to whom we can attribute the classification. To the recorder, who was perhaps zealous about whitening a public servant, or to Barreto, who always underlined blackness in his work. The person that was writing the anamnesis wrote, "The observant is an individual with strong complexion presenting stigmas of physical degeneration." What immediately stands out are two powerful words, stigmas of degeneration. Stigma originates from the terminology of the criminal anthropology first articulated by Cesare Lombroso, who studied the supposed parallels between mixed race, criminality, and madness. Stigma thus supposes the presence of essential traits tied to races. Furthermore, it also assumes that heredity is the determining factor behind behavior. The procedures follow the hospital protocol. Roxo, the director of the observation pavilion, developed a new technique for the examination of the subjects of alienation. The recorder would take note of the patient's physical data, define the patient's physiognomy, and finally, his general physical state. The next step was more objective and focused on anthropometric information, skull, face, ears, nose, as you saw before. Then finally came a stage considered to be more subjective, that is, the patient's living conditions. In this case, Roxo argued that it was necessary to gain the patient's trust so as to let him speak, deixá-lo falar. Emotional and intellectual tendencies of the internees were also noted. Anamnesis was duly a sign of madness. Excessive religiosity was immediately diagnosed as fanatism. Just excessive in political interest, as especially towards anarchism, were also considered a stigma of the generation. Labeled as loco morais, moral insane, anarchists were condemned for their ideas and stigmatized as mentally ill. One can therefore imagine Lima Barreto's fear, as well as his insistence on silencing his anarchist sympathies, considered a sign of intellectual degeneration. The case of alcoholism, as the case of Lima Barreto, were those that remained less time in the hospital. Pinheiro, one of the hospital's scriveners, wrote about Lima Barreto, "All bodily systems seem normal. The only issue worthy of note is that the genital urinary local shows gonorrhea." This venereal disease represented a new symptom of degeneration, since it implied excess, lack of control, and perversion. Lima Barreto was interviewed again in August, when he should have been less influenced by the effects of the alcohol, and therefore more capable of speaking. So much so that, under family informations, Barreto informs that his mother died of tuberculosis. Later, Only later did Barreto reveal that his father suffered from supposed neurasthenia. This concept was introduced by Miller-Bird and referred to a state of nervous exhaustion. Lima Barreto decided not to mention his father's illness, only to reveal it later on. He says, "I confess my father has neurasthenia." I truly believe he had knowledge about those theories, those heredity theories, and fears that his father's disease would become a stigma and to determine his own weakness. The hospital scrivener noted that Barreto knew a lot of things, he wrote. Barreto knows names of cities, ancient facts, Middle history, modern contemporary history. He also knows, writes the scrivener, algebra, geometry, geography. So one can easily suppose the shock the scrivener felt by the hospital, knowing of Barreto's erudition. Barreto also mentioned some writers, some favorite writers he mentioned, Bossuet, Chateaubriand, Balzac, Taine. And the scrivener also notes that the internee has knowledge of French and English. In sum, wrote the scrivener, in sum, this is an individual that has some knowledge and intelligence considering where he lives. Along with the compliment comes the customary prejudice comment. From then on, Barreto emerged from the files and appears slightly delirious, intervening work problems with fears regarding his anarchist fame. It's in this manner that Barreto testimony draws to a close, with the record notes. The patient seems to be generally calm. The patient says that he worked 2 books, The Patron and the Memoirs of the Scrivener, Isaías Caminha. The conclusion regarding his illness and his treatment was nonetheless clear. Alcoholism to be cured with purgatives and opiums. This episode helps us to understand Barreto's positions more delineated in his fiction work, The Cemetery of the Living, and hidden in his character, the fiction character, Vicente Mascarenhas. There is a chapter when Vicente Mascarenhas says, "The doctors, I do not know how and when, have acquired an obsession for generalizations. They suspect any foreigner with a strange name. They suspect every citizen of color. Every citizen of color must be called malandro." That's very difficult to translate, no? You have to help me here. Scroll down, I don't know. In the novel, Barreto suggests was like that he was living the spectacle of madness, communing within nonsense of the mad, and recognizing that in the hospital, I quote, "all is black." As Barreto himself concludes, those were my sad partners in isolation and social segregation. Truly, liberty had nothing to do with equality. Lima Barreto was released from the hospital on October, but the vicious circles of alcohol, deliriums, and turbulations and admission would not end there. On December of the same year, he was brought back to the hospital. Yet another period of hospitalization took place between December 19 and February 10-20. These 2 episodes, both occurring during the Christmas season, marks a second moment in Barreto's lives. In the second moment emerged quite a different Barreto from the man of 1914. You can see the portrait. Filled with resignation, or perhaps attempting to remain anonymous, this time, as he confessed in the questionnaire of the hospital, Barreto is another man in the file. This time, the hospital recorder classifies Barreto as pardo. I don't know if you could see here. brown or mixed race. If we have time, we can talk about this term. Pardo is a kind of none of the others, the otherness of the otherness, no? But not white. No? The divergence from the first classification suggests the difficulties the institution faced regarding racial ambiguity. It's quite possible that in this quite Brazilian form of racism, in which one can be whitened or darkened depending on the social situation, Barreto became evidently black or pardo. His body language this time is troubled and depressed. His head falling to the side and a much less resistant facial expression is very clear to note. He appears to be, as his body betrayed him, his profound convictions. And if his body was trying to recover the social determinist theories. After all, in his diary, he always demonstrates how critical he was against this kind of science, stating that science was merely a perspective on things. But this time, the situation was different. The inspector of the section came with external information about the father. And then the scrivener wrote, Barreto's father is currently in an advanced state of dementia. Even the scrivener, even so, the scrivener could recognize the writer. He wrote, the observer enjoys literature and the reputation of a talented and powerful writer. It seems that the observer in his talks in cafes, as you saw the cafe, is very well known and has some kind of popularity. Now, Barreto stayed in the hospital this second time for more 2 months. Now, out of the hospital and dealing with the safe terrain of the fiction in his novel, he voices through his characters the reflection he silenced during the time he was in the hospital. He criticized the policy. He also refutes the authority and pride of the doctors. He writes, that performs their practice in the vague and nebulous heaven of human madness. In the closing pages of Cemitério dos Vivos, Cemetery of the Living, as in a crescendo, he refers to the insane and to himself as the refuse of society, and asks himself with a pinch of irony, is the Constitution really for you people? It's evidently impossible to forget that at that time, Nina Rodrigues, a famous physician from the Tropical School of Bahia, was talking about and giving a lot of lectures in Brazil and outside Brazil about the deterministic theories in Brazil. In his book, he published this book, The Penal Responsibility, in 1888, the same year of the abolition, and he proposed to have 2 penal codes, 2 constitutions, one for the blacks, another one for the whites. That's why it's so easy to see how you can travel between the novel, the fiction, and the non-fiction, with Barreto saying in the fiction, the agent and that he was the indigent ill and social parent. And he writes, I have fallen from dream to dream. Lima Barreto would eventually succumb to a cardiac arrest in 1922, shortly after he wrote those drafts and his upcoming book. He escaped from the hospital to retire himself in his home, in his library. Cemitério dos Vivos, Cemetery of the Living, would remain without an official close. Distinct from the other books, which, despite also being biographical, placed all meaning upon a fictional character and carried an objective project of social denunciation. In this case, mimesis is at the heart of the Cemetery of the Living. Sometimes I wrote the original of this document, and sometimes he instead of writing Vicente Mascarenhas, he writes his name, Lima Barreto. In an art, it's not coincidence, and in 1920, he published an article called The Contact. Barreto tried once more to separate himself from his work, stating that he only admitted himself in the hospital because he wanted to observe better the situation in the hospital. It was a final strategy at that moment. He had already come to occupy an inclassifiable space. As Michael Tosi said, mimesis is the space on neither be I, neither be the other. He was trying to write an ethnography of himself. It was not Lima Barreto's wish to publish the content of his diaries, of his draft novel, but these two works of personal memory confirm our impression of his final days. Memory here comes to represent a sort of seal of his afflicted ego, a complicated negotiation between poverty, race, and madness in this case. In his chronic that he called Da Minha Cela, From My Cell, he recalls with a combination of irony and suffering his mesurations. He wrote, I was subjected to anthropometric mensurations which resulted in one small displeasure. I'm brachiocephalic. This term refers to individuals whose cues have a flat posterior face. This was a condition frequently associated with inferior biological types. It's clear that he has a humoristic purpose, but we know, however, that the effectiveness of a joke resides in the combination of allusions that it presents or hides. Barreto contested, yet feared, and dialogically with the categorizations he suffered. That was a very dangerous mimesis, and show us how social marks of difference can be used in a very positive way and in a very discriminatory form. Barreto, in the sense, was far from the concept of belonging and was lost in this perverse game of citizenship and rights, of inclusion and social exclusion. Thank you very much.